Well, thanks everybody. Thanks. It's a real honour to receive this award. And people were joking at breakfast, do people get any advance warning about it? And I said yes, but I didn't say any more than that. So I did get a bit of advance warning. A Lifetime Achievement Award seems a bit weird because I'm hoping that this isn't the end of my lifetime. And I thought because of that, rather than look back, I would try and look forward. So I'm going to talk about where I want to go and where I hope some of you will also want to go in the future. And so I'm going to be talking about thinking about life as a cyber biophysical system. And the aim of this is to develop a science and engineering discipline of all living systems. So that includes biolife, terrestrial life, extraterrestrial life, as well as artificial life, be it synthetic biology, oil droplets, other material life, but also virtual life, all combined in one discipline, and how we can actually get that as a discipline. So let's think about cyber biophysical systems. What does that actually mean? So biology, we all hopefully have heard of that. And the bit that's relevant is it's the science of complexity. And so biology covers genetics, evolution, development and morphogenesis, metabolism, energetics, ecology, societies of organisms, and so on. But we also need to understand how physics interacts with that, because life is embodied in matter using energy. So we have the science of thermodynamics, which is very important. We had some interesting talks about that yesterday. Dynamical systems for how processes work and so on. But then computing is also essential for understanding and developing life processes, because computing is all about information and processing are key to living systems. And as well as having the corners of the triangle, yes, the vertices of the triangle, we've got the edges, so cyber physical systems. That usually means quite hard things in current terminology, but here I'm thinking about just embodied information processing, robotics, particularly soft robotics, representations of information in matter. And on the biophysics axis, we've got the fact that life is physically embodied, and we have to take the laws of physics into account. It's not just that genetics constrains everything, the second law of thermodynamics constrains things as well. And on the biocomputing side, we've got synthetic biology actually trying to program bacteria and other things to do things, but we've also got biomimetic and bio-inspired ideas, self-star systems, and so on. And then if we bring all this together, we've got cyber biophysical systems, which is too much of a mouthful, so I just call these zoetic systems. That's from the Greek zoe, which just means life. Now, I started off as a physicist and sort of gradually morphed into a computer scientist over the years. So I'm sitting on the bottom line of this, but I'm also interested in all of the other aspects of it as well. So what I'm going to do today is not talk about the whole of this. I'm just going to pick out a few aspects where I think we need to make progress, aspects that are particularly of interest to me, at least, where we need to make progress, particularly in formalisms and how we model and how we analyze these kinds of systems, because some of the formalisms we have today are inadequate for this. So when I'm talking also about cyber biophysical systems, they're not in isolation. Life is not a single organism. Life is an entire ecosystem and society. So you have these systems, be they real or artificial. They exist in the context of other similar systems, but they also exist in a context of natural systems in a physical environment with energetics, in an artificial environment, a built environment potentially, of stationary and moving systems, and with lots of people around, and everything is interacting with everything else. And I'm just going to stop at this point and ask if somebody could get me some water, because I'm okay at the moment, but I'm not going to be for much longer. Okay, thanks. Sorry, I should have thought of that beforehand. Right, so as I said, I'm just going to pick out certain things that I think are important. And the first thing, I've talked about matter being important, physics being important. So, and a lot of us, myself included, work in the virtual world a lot of the time. So what about virtual life? Is that going to be possible? Is virtual embodiment possible? So the biologist Robert Rosen, his answer is no. He says what the difference is between an organism, he's talking about biological systems, is that an organism, as opposed to a mechanism, is closed to efficient causation, and that the mechanism can't be so closed. And by efficient causation, he's referring to Aristotle's efficient cause. That's the cause that brings something about. As Rosen says, life is self-defining, it's self-causing, it's autopoietic. And he says that simulations and programs can't be so closed because they require something outside the system to define them. They have an arbitrary semantics. It's a non-grounded in the physical system. So you have a virtual machine which implements the semantics of the artificial system, and that implementation is itself the thing that is grounded in the underlying physical computer. And he says, and because that's arbitrary, and he says life has only one semantics, it doesn't have these two layers, it has one physical semantics. Well, that's a bit of a downer. However, Antoine Danchin, in this rather nice book, The Delphic Boat, which hopefully many of you will recognize the allusion being made there, his answer is probably yes. You could have virtual life. And he points out, actually, that in biological life, there is at least one level, if not more, levels of indirection in the way material objects of organisms represent their functionality. Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. 2. Redundancy, biology. Yeah, so he says this is, he points out there's essentially an arbitrary mapping between the codons and the amino acids they code for. You have tRNAs that implement this mapping between the codons and the amino acid, but those tRNAs could be different. There could be a different genetic code. So at that level, there's a degree of arbitrariness. We could consider this to be a virtual machine. Danchin takes the computational metaphor quite seriously and ends up talking about operating systems and what have you. But that degree of arbitrariness breaks that essential grounding that Rosen was talking about, saying that you can potentially have layers of virtual machines with an arbitrary semantics, that it's the next layer down that grounds it. So yay, that means we can potentially have virtual artificial life, so that's good. But one of the things that's important, as well as saying that, which means that we're actually not wasting our time using computers, but that self-application is important, and the embodiedness of that self-application needs to be considered. And I'll say what I mean by that. Self-application means that various things have to be made of the same kind of stuff. In particular, let's call it the data, the information, and the program, the thing that specifies what processing, are made of the same kind of stuff in biology. The data is the DNA codons. The program is the proteins or RNA machinery that are themselves encoded on the DNA and that are active, and they are the same kind of stuff, i.e. chemicals. And the proteins and RNA machines include machinery that regulates, expresses, and copies the DNA. So they kind of act on themselves and act on the DNA. They can actually modify the DNA, and hence they can indirectly modify themselves. And so we've got a system in biology of self-modifying code, which is really important to be able to do that. It's crucial in biology. In classical computer science, it's anathema. You know, the whole point of the von Neumann architecture is to separate code and data, because in fact, they are actually the same kind of stuff, they're bits, and they could get confused. And if you get confused of what's your program and your data, and you start trampling all over your program, you don't know what's going to happen next, which computer scientists don't like. But that's the essence of open-ended systems and evolution and so on. So it's crucial to be able to have self-modifying systems. And one of the ways that we can do that in artificial life, and one of the things I've been working on with Simon, who's possibly in the audience somewhere, is automata ACHEMs. I know there's Tierra and Avida, but there's also our stringmall system where we do those experiments of self-modifying code. And yes, we don't know what's going to happen, and that's really exciting because really interesting things do actually happen. So being of the same kind of stuff is important. So I talked about the same kind of stuff. So that's the stuff that defines and does the processing has to be the same kind of stuff as the information that defines what kind of processing happens and what is being processed. And so the dynamics is important there. So I'm going to mention a little bit about processes and dynamics. There's a very famous quote by Charlotte Perkins Gilman: "Life is a verb, not a noun." Life isn't a thing, it's a process. And if you start thinking of it as a process rather than a thing, lots of questions that people ask about life, like what happens, where does it go when you die, become non-questions because it's not a thing that goes somewhere. So Tim Ingold, way back in the 90s, was talking about wanting to move biology back away from just grubbling around in biochemistry and genetics to an organism-centric biology, you know, biology back to thinking about organisms. And he had this rather nice quote of what such a biology would look like. And he said, "It must be a biology that asserts the primacy of processes over events, of relationships over entities, and of development over structure." So it's very much there. He's talking about a very process-oriented view of change, of things happening, rather than the stuff sort of just sitting there. So, and then he said, life is not a thing but a process, a never-resting stream of events. So we've got to think about these concepts of process and dynamics and relationships and development and trajectories through state spaces and so on, rather than thinking so much about substance and entities and events and states and things. So this process view is really important, and it changes the way you think about things, because change is the default. And it's when things don't change that require explanation. So stability requires explanation. Change is the natural state. And so we start talking in words that end in ing. So we talk about life is about living, it's about becoming, being, and ceasing. And becoming, there are lots of different ways of becoming: assembling, dividing, building, metamorphosing. And then the being, the sort of the lifetime, maintaining, repairing, but growing, adapting, learning, interacting with other processes. And then there's the ceasing, and there are different ways of ceasing as well: dissolving, merging. But one way of ceasing is differentiating, ceasing to be one kind of process and becoming another kind of process. So we need a formalism for talking more about processes than things. So what might such a formalism be? Well, we could start with thinking about process algebras. So in computer science, there's a subset of languages called process algebras, which are very much defining traces, never-ending streams, never-resting streams of events. Now, classical Turing machine-like programming is the underlying mathematics is classical set theory or well-founded set theory. And the point about well-founded set theory is you can have a set, and the elements in that set can be sets, and the elements in those sets can be sets. But eventually, if you go down far enough, you get to the bottom. You get to things that aren't sets, you get to atoms. and that's the axiom of well-foundedness. It was specifically introduced to get around certain paradoxes of self-reference in order to forbid you to even be able to state certain self-referential properties. Process algebras were invented by computer scientists, and then the mathematician said, you can't do that, that doesn't work. Oh, we'll invent some mathematics where it does work. And that mathematics, in fact, has the anti-foundation axiom, and is non-well-founded set theory, which is a horrible name because non-well-founded sounds as if it's bad. It's not bad, it's just a different branch of mathematics. And in that case, sets still has sets, but sets can have sets as elements forever. There is no need to have a bottom. There is no requirement to have a bottom. It can have infinite downward chains. It can be turtles all the way down. And then, more importantly, I think for living systems, you can have self-referential cycles, like you can have X is an element of X, which if you try and write that in well-founded set theory, goes, no, you can't say that. Or X is an element of Y is an element of X. And this is exactly what you need for self-referential and autopoietic systems. And I call that turtles all the way round. You can have a system like that. So that is looking like it's a possibility. And actually, I think our hang-up with the axiom of well-foundedness, even if we don't realize that that's what our hang-up is in some sense a formalism of reductionism. It is implying there is a bottom. You can take things apart until you've got the atoms, whatever level you decide to call atomic, and then you can build up from those atoms, but there is some kind of base level that you can build from, even if you're sort of breaking it down and building it back up again. And it might be that our scientific intuitions about reality, if we're kind of from the physics end of science rather than the biology end, and you notice a bias I've got here that science goes from physics to biology. I think some people would think there are other things further on, but I'm just talking about physics to biology. Certainly on the physics end, very much based on how objects are constructed. Maybe we've been skewed by this foundation axiom and thinking that things have to have a bottom. And in particular, as I said, this branch of mathematics was invented specifically to outlaw paradoxes of self-reference, like Russell's paradox, but actually biology is one big paradox of self-reference. And so we've now got a mathematics that has specifically outlawed being able to model biology, which doesn't seem very helpful. So we could use the more process algebra style of non-well-founded. And actually, this is nowadays, rather than that big mouthful of non-well-founded set theory, it's now called co-algebra. So that's easier to say. So there's a problem with using this approach. It's not as well understood as set theory or algebra style. I mean, we were all taught set theory and algebra at our mother's knee or in kindergarten. We all know that kind of in our bones. That's the way we were brought up. Co-algebra and co-induction, they're not taught at our mother's knee, unless we've got a very mathematical mother. And so there's not, most of the literature is written for mathematicians or very highly theoretical computer scientists. It's not written for practitioners. So I want someone pleased to write this book, Co-algebra for Dummies. If you were getting all excited thinking it actually exists, Photoshop is a wonderful thing. And I want someone pleased to write this book for me. The applications in certain sorts of process algebra don't feel natural, at least to me. Interactions between processes are not first-class entities. And in fact, one of the things that happens often when you try and write some process algebra stuff is things deadlock very easily. And I can say the real world does not deadlock. I am speaking to you, and if you are not listening, I don't deadlock, I just carry on speaking, okay? So that's fine, that's good. But also the straightforward forms of process algebra are closed to endogenous novelty. That means they can't change themselves. They also are not set up for self-modifying processes. So when they're used, for example, to model chemical reactions, you've got processes that are atoms communicating on predefined channels in order to form reactions and so on. What you need for endogenous novelty is for the system itself to be able to create new processes, new kinds of processes, new channels, new kinds of channels for communication. So you can't have sort of emergent processes happening in these systems as they currently exist. Okay, so that's processes, and that's one of the things that we potentially need for processes. Let's add material into the mix, or maybe not. Okay, don't know what that happened. The machine deadlocked. Maybe it's listening to what I'm saying. So matter matters. The process view is critical for understanding life. Life is a process, but it's not a disembodied process. It's embodied in matter. Even if it's embodied in some kind of virtual matter, it's embodied in something. So matter gives structure and dynamics, or matter is structure and dynamics in some sense. And that structure can be used to embody or encode the information that's necessary. And then the dynamics is used to process that embodied information. And then a system, we can then say that we're interested in, is a process that has an identity, a process that can have a sort of a line drawn around it and is a thing. Not all processes are systems, but we can say a system is a process with identity. So an embodied system has matter and structure and dynamics. So an example of this that I've been working on, again with colleagues in the audience, physical reservoir computing. So the computational model here is an echo state network, which is a random recurrent neural network. So the actual neural network itself is fixed with random conditions, and all you have to train is the output layer. And that makes it a really useful system to use physical material to implement the reservoir, because you don't have to train the inside, unlike with a classical neural network. You don't have to train the internal weights, only the external weights. You can take away the model and slap a piece of appropriate material in its place, a piece of material that has an appropriate structure and dynamics. And the way I say that is that it's a piece of material that wobbles in an interesting way when you kick it. And so you can implement computation just in physical material in this way as a reservoir computer. There are other ways to implement computation in physical material, but it's computing with the material dynamics. And then you can also, if you want, take the trained output from this system and feed it back in as part of its input. And so you can, if you feed it back in as all of its input, you can make an autonomous system, or as part of its input, you can just use it as an extra signal. So why am I talking about this? Well, physical reservoir computing for soft robot control. So Kohei Nakajima is giving a keynote tomorrow, and he might be talking about some of this, but this is his work I'm talking about now. Really fascinating work on using an octopus arm. I emphasize it's a synthetic octopus arm, but you use an octopus arm as a reservoir. So the octopus arm is the material that is wobbling in an interesting way when you kick it. So this is the octopus arm. I can't do it very well because obviously I've got not enough joints, but you feed a signal in at the top, which is your input. It wobbles because of the way you're moving it. And then you observe that wobbling through the trained output layer as your computation of interest. And then what you can potentially do is then you can feed back that trained output as part of the input. So if you train the reservoir to be a controller of itself, you can then use the body as the computer to compute its own dynamics. And so that's something where you've got real embodied computation. You don't need a separate brain. Now, obviously, an octopus is a bad example of this because it's got brains galore. I mean, it's got at least 9 brains, but it's a good example of how you can use the system itself to compute at least some of its own dynamics. Okay, so that's matter and dynamics. But one of the things that I said was important, and obviously it's important for biological systems at least, grow and develop. How can we think about growth and development within this context? Well, one formalism that people use a lot is generative grammars or growth grammars, those kinds of things. We're used to seeing lots of these kind of pretty pictures of developmental processes defined in this way. L systems is the most common example that people use, Lindenmayer systems, which are just rewriting rules, where you can get more and more sophisticated versions where you can have input from the environment affecting the growth, and you can have feedback affecting the growth. So you have these lovely pictures of artificial topiary and things like that. But that's a formalism that we can use to define growth. We also need to be able to naturally stop the growth, but very often you stop it by putting a flower on the end rather than more branches. And L systems are great because you can have different rules that have different outcomes. So you can obviously, they were first invented for defining how biological systems grow, and they're used to do things like these pictures of trees, but they've been adapted to grow other things. So this, I don't know, industrial plant-like looking thing, well, okay, that's also developed by an L system. And so what's the actual underlying formalism? I said generative grammars. There's this very nice system called DSDS, or Dynamical Systems with Dynamical Structure. Lovely piece of mathematical work by Giavitto and Michel, which actually subsumes lots of these growth grammars. You can define these growth grammars, L systems, growth grammars, P systems, lots of things like that in this system. So that's a really nice system, which isn't used as much as it should be. But of course, actually, classical computer programs grow their state space all the time. Physics might have difficulty growing its state space, but programmers can just go malloc if you're old, or new object if you're younger. And then that grows the state space with the new memory you've allocated, and then it shrinks again later when garbage collection happens. And so object orientation, obviously, therefore, is a potential way of modeling some of this stuff. An object has state, i.e. has structure, it has behavior, which is has process, and it has identity. That's what makes it an object. So you can have two objects that are the same in every way, except for the fact that they're different objects. So it's virtual matter with structure and dynamics. And remember, I said a system was a process with an identity. So it might be a way of having simplified models of systems. And I don't really need to preach much more about this because lots of people use object-oriented approaches for simulating systems. But, problem, all of this is discrete. They're discrete state spaces, it's discrete state, discrete time. If you look at the cell cycle from a sufficient level of abstraction, i.e. those of you in the back who can't see the details so well, you have one cell, it does stuff, and then you have two cells. But actually, there's this part in between where it's kind of neither one cell nor two cells, it's continuously deforming and then becomes two. And sort of the, and if you look at some bacteria, it's really difficult to even do that kind of abstraction because the DNA has started dividing for the next generation of division before the first division has happened. So you can't even say, I'm going to draw a line here and a line here and a line here, because that mess is happening in between. It's easy in a discrete space, discrete time system to add new dimensions. You just go new, and then by magic, new dimensions have appeared at the next time step. How do you do that in a continuous system? How do you continuously introduce a new continuous dimension? And not only that, even if you solve that problem, and there were some interesting discussions yesterday about some continuous linear system, we need hybrid systems. We do need a combination of both discrete and continuous systems. And another problem with these formalisms, again, is that they are closed. The growth rules, the development rules are fixed. They're hard-coded into the programs. We write an object-oriented program. They don't grow themselves along with the space that is growing. So the growing space should open up new possibilities, should have new rules, new ways of growing that can appear as the system grows. We want rules that change rules. We want rules that change rules that change rules, and so on. This is the open-ended growth that we need in development and evolutionary processes. So the developmental program itself develops. And this idea of self-modifying rules of development, that it can self-develop, is that we don't just need a system that has dynamics, a system that moves around its state space. We need a system that has metadynamics, which defines the dynamics of the state space itself. So classical dynamical systems theory, very well developed, trajectories in a state space. We're used to that. We're used to seeing pictures of the Lorentz attractor and things like that. But with growth, the state space itself changes as a result of the dynamics or as a result of inputs. But if we're thinking of autonomous systems, of self-developmental systems, the dynamics that's happening in the state space changes that state space. It might do it simply by changing where retractors are and changing where bifurcations occur, but the really interesting part is when it changes that dimensionality. You could almost think of it as I'm moving through a state space, which is this room, and suddenly I get to a portal, and then I can disappear through that portal. I won't, I promise. I can disappear through that portal, and suddenly there's a whole new part of the state space because my trajectory has moved me into there. But you have to actually think of it as me walking through that door actually creates the auditorium rather than the fact it was already always waiting for me. So metadynamics is the dynamics of the state space. So you have meta trajectories, which are where the meta state variables are state spaces and how you can move through those. And of course, being a good computer scientist, as soon as you go one level meta, you know, there are only three numbers in computer science, 0, 1, and infinity. So I can, if I've gone up one level, I can do it again and again and again, and I can have meta dynamics and so on. How do you formalize that? How do you capture that in a formalism that you can do anything with? So what we're ending up with is constructive open dynamical systems. They're dynamical systems, that's the processing that's going on. They're open in that they're open to change of their very fundamentals, and they're constructive in that they can grow. So we've got a sequence going from closed or autonomous dynamical systems, which is what most dynamical systems theory is. It comes from physics, where you know your state space to start with. You've got a set of equations which give you the number of degrees of freedom and dimensions. Then you can move to open systems where you've got input. So if you think of a closed dynamical system as you've got a fixed landscape and you're skiing over a fixed landscape is your trajectory. An open dynamical system in that sense is that there are little demons underneath the ground, moving the ground up and down as you're skiing around it. Or actually your skiing around it is changing the state space itself. But then constructive ones, you're getting more and more dimensions as the dynamics happens, and you've got the metadynamics describing how those new dimensions happen. What formalism do we have for that? Well, at the moment, I'm not aware of anything. Okay, so talking about that, but what about the physics of living, thermodynamics? Far from equilibrium thermodynamics. So most physics, certainly the physics that I was taught during my degree, is essentially equilibrium systems or systems moving towards equilibrium, closed, isolated systems, minimizing their free energy, maximizing their entropy. We don't want that in living systems. A living system at equilibrium isn't actually living, it's dead. We don't want equilibrium systems. Non-equilibrium systems, so what physicists do, the first thing they do if they've got a system that works and they want to change it slightly, they do a small perturbation. And you can then have non-equilibrium systems, but it's a small perturbation away from equilibrium. But living systems are far from equilibrium systems. They're open, driven, dissipative systems. They, to stay far from equilibrium, they need an inflow of free energy and an outflow of entropy, food and waste. And so they need to be in a system that provides that, and they use that to maintain themselves in a far from equilibrium state. But again, the formalisms, the science of far from equilibrium systems is not as well developed as it needs to be for our purposes. And in particular, it's very easy to use words like free energy and temperature and entropy, but they are not as well defined in far from equilibrium systems. They are actually terms that were invented and defined for equilibrium systems, and they might not be quite as well defined, so that even those kind of fundamental ideas need to be firmed up and thought about more. And the material embodiment, the other side of the physics of living. I talked about material with structure and dynamics, and I've been talking about the dynamics, but what about the structure, the thing that encodes the information, embodies the information, and that enables the dynamics that processes that information? So biology does this through highly evolved biopolymers, DNA, RNA, and proteins. So the DNA and RNA can encode information, and the RNA and the proteins enable the functional dynamics or implement the functional dynamics of the systems. Metamaterials is a term for material science, which means highly engineered materials, highly engineered to have novel functional properties. And these novel functional properties are usually, because people are material scientists, they're thinking about material kinds of properties, optical, electrical, mechanical kinds of properties. I'm thinking about computational properties. You can engineer materials to have computational properties. I've already talked about reservoir computing, physical reservoir computing, where you can slap a piece of material to be the reservoir. It's not quite as easy as that. Nearly everything works, but it doesn't work particularly well, but you can engineer it to work better. So you engineer it, it becomes a metamaterial that works better as a physical reservoir. So smart functional materials, smart matter, it's been engineered to have both computational properties, but also it can still be engineered to have functional properties. And then you get really interesting embodied systems where the computation and the material functional properties are completely intertwined, beginning to sound like a living system where we have lots of information embodied in this, but there's lots of other stuff going on as well. We're not just computers. So the biopolymers we can think of as being actually evolved metamaterials rather than engineered metamaterials. And so living systems are embodied in highly evolved smart functional metamaterials, and then hopefully highly engineered smart functional metamaterials. And this enables us to move from the idea of mere machines to living machines, because people often say, well, you know, organisms aren't mere machines. So what does, no, we're not mere machines. But so what is a mere machine? So I'm saying a mere machine is something that has a dynamics that is kind of cyclic, performing its function. It's like a factory machine making widgets. It makes a widget in a cycle, it makes the next widget, it makes the next widget. It's engineered to do just that thing. And its metadynamics is trivial and extrinsic. Maybe it's, you know, you can repair the system, you can reset the system. Computational machines Next level up, their dynamics is non-trivial. I mean, we have the halting problem, we have undecidability and so on. They're unpredictable, and they're also open. A computer's not much use if you can't give it input or get output from it. But with computers, the metadynamics is relatively trivial. It's certainly simple, and it's reversible in principle. You know, have you tried switching it off and on again? You can actually return to a previous state, factory reset if all else fails. Living machines, again, have a non-trivial, unpredictable open dynamics, but also have a non-trivial, unpredictable open metadynamics. And once you get to that, it becomes irreversible. So you can't just switch us off and on again or reset us to an earlier state in any sensible manner. Right, so those are some things that I want for the science of self-producing, far from equilibrium systems that are embodied in smart functional materials with non-trivial metadynamics. And this is a transdisciplinary subject, which is going to require input from biology, chemistry, physics, material science, computing, cybernetics, complexity science, artificial life, mathematics, philosophy, and probably more. But how do we get there from here? I've been given my 5-minute warning, so I'm going to speed up slightly. I'm nearly at the end, but not quite. So science, what is science? So my definition of science is studying the world as it is. So in order to build models of increasing explanatory and predictive power. But science is what's there. And I contrast that with engineering, which is us making the world as we want it to be, changing things. And we do that by building artifacts of increasing sophistication and capability. So a little bit of history. Classical thermodynamics is kind of today fundamental physics, absolutely fundamental physics. You can't get anywhere in physics without tripping over it. But it was invented in order to solve an engineering problem. Back in the day of the first early steam engines, people wanted to know how efficient you could make a steam engine, and thermodynamics was invented in order to answer that question. So we could take a page from history, and let's focus on developing zoetic engineering. Let's build stuff and use that to kickstart the zoetic science in order to know what we can build and what constraints there are on what we can build as well. So in analogy to where thermodynamics came from. So which artifacts should we build? Which application domains might be interesting? Well, my favorite one is the thinking about the technology of construction versus artifacts. So today, our technology that constructs an artifact is separate from our technology of that artifact. We have machines that build widgets. So they are allopoietic systems, which means an other-making system, rather than an autopoietic system, which means a self-making system. Hopefully, tomorrow's technology will be both the artifact and its construction all in one, including the maintenance. In other words, an autopoietic system, a living technology. So maybe we could have a grand challenge of growing a skyscraper. It's a grand challenge because it's clearly a ridiculously ambitious thing to want to do, but it's not as ridiculously ambitious as maybe trying to build a living, mobile, intelligent artificial system. So skyscrapers don't need as much of a brain as a dog or something like that. But we need to think about growable matter, designing and engineering that material, autopoietic metamaterials, so that we can embody all the functionality and computation in them. And then we also need to program and guide the desired outcome. We want to grow a skyscraper, not some Frankensteinian monster that takes over the world. So we need to be able to control and understand and analyze its metadynamics. Should we grow or should we build? So these are termite mounds. Well, two of them are termite mounds. These are built by living organisms, but they are built of non-living matter, sort of mud or termite excreta, whatever it is that they're actually built of. But actually, why not both? Growth can exploit building. You can have scaffolding to grow up. You can have a trellis. You can have inorganic components included, wires and pipes. Then you can garden the results to tailor the growth to the way you want it to go. So termites can exploit the growth. So termites are stigmergic. So once the system, they have grown the system to a shape, it has now changed. So their behavior now changes. So they're exploiting the growth. So, and frankly, why build parts that can grow themselves, or why grow parts that are easier to build? And then I'm talking about gardening of the input being used to change and constrain the system. So we can have a spectrum from pure seed growth all the way to pure termite building, which is then being modified by a gardener using stigmergy maybe to prune and train the growing structures. So this is one potential form of zoetic engineering, gardening, living, growing technology. So zoetics. So we want a program of designing and constructing these artifacts, of increasing sophistication and technology, using that to develop this discipline of zoetic engineering to kickstart the discipline of zoetic science. I'm a scientist, not an engineer. Well, I think of myself that way. So I'm wanting the science, but I think going via engineering is potentially the way to do that. So just to conclude, we started off thinking of steam engines requiring the invention of thermodynamics. We've come a long way since then. We have steam trains, then we have more sophisticated things. We've got jet engines. We've now been to Pluto and beyond with spacecraft. That's come a long way. We're not quite so far with growing living technology. We're maybe at the swarmbots stage, or what the keynote yesterday said, sort of the Wright brothers stage of aircraft. We want to go to much more sophisticated systems. There's a beautiful quote from James Burke talking about this steam engine to spacecraft transition, where he said, at no time in the past, when people were doing these early steam engines, could anybody have known that what they were doing then would end up like this now. The people inventing steam engines had no concept of sending spacecraft to Pluto. Maybe we can be more imaginative, and maybe we can imagine a living technology. Or maybe we can't. Maybe what will happen will be unimaginable, and we can't imagine where it's going to go. So what I'm going to say is, let's go there and find out. Thank you.